As economic reforms appear to be underway in North Korea, we ask, is the new leadership prepared to follow through with them? Is North Korea shifting from its military-first approach to a new emphasis on the economy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Shakuntala Santharan. A rare session of North Korea's parliament ended on Tuesday with no mention of rumoured economic reforms. Stories have been circulating for months. The changes are reportedly being pushed by the new leader Kim Jong-un. And the second session of the Supreme People's Assembly, which usually meets only once a year, has fueled speculation about drastic reforms to come under Kim. He's made several public statements on the need to improve living standards, and there have been signs of policy changes, including incentives for workers and farmers to boost productivity. But at the close of the meeting, state media reported only a decision by the Assembly to add one extra year to compulsory schooling in the reclusive state, as well as a minor reshuffle in the Parliament's Standing Committee. Kim Jong-un took power in December following the death of his father, Kim Jong-Il. The new leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is believed to be in his late 20s. He's been named the great successor and North Korea's new supreme leader. In July, North Korea named a new military chief, Hyun Yong-chol. That happened a day after his predecessor, Ri Yong-ho, was removed from all his posts. The state-run news agency said Ri was relieved of his duties because of illness, without giving further details. Days later, Kim Jong-un was appointed Marshal of the Republic. That's the highest military rank. So is real change underway in North Korea, and is Kim Jong-un the man leading the way? To answer these questions, we're joined by our guest in Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, an economist and political commentator. In Washington, Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute specializing in foreign policy. And in Brussels, Glyn Ford, a former member of the European Parliament. Mr. Ford is the author of a book called North Korea on the Brink: Struggle for Survival. Welcome to you all. Glyn, if I could start with you, this second annual session of the North Korean Parliament is highly unusual, isn't it? There's been speculation for months that North Korea might introduce economic reforms, but only some education reforms were announced on Tuesday. Are economic reforms of the farming sector, really taking place from what you're hearing?
Well, I mean, reform of the farming sector started in 2002 with the agricultural reforms under Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-Il, and they were rather successful in terms of limiting the targets in the from farmers and allowing them to sell the surplus on the new emerging markets. It looks like more of the same, and frankly, they don't need the Supreme People's Assembly to authorise that. It's not the decision-making body in question. The problem is that it's not agriculture that's the real crunch issue for North Korea. It's industry, and the industrial reforms back in the same period, a decade ago, really didn't work, because taking people off the plan, allowing them to choose product and process, allowing them to hire and fire, doesn't work if you don't have electricity, reliable electricity, and you don't have the raw materials. So I think the agricultural reforms are an incremental change on what's already been happening and are likely to be successful. The key issue is going to be industry.
Andrew, do you think Kim Jong-un is serious about reform?
Well, I think that this time it is much more serious than before, in the sense that once he was installed in power, he quickly removed a hardliner from the military, and of course this is very unusual for the Parliament to meet the second time in a year, suggesting that there is something more serious to be done. But I think the most important thing is that the past formula of repression and also relying on the nuclear threat and no longer proved to work. And a lot of people are dying of hunger. And also North Korea has been relying on China's largesse. And of course, frankly, I mean, Beijing is quite annoyed with North Korea in the sense that Beijing doesn't want a nuclear proliferation along its borders, because they were set in train a whole chain reaction of nuclear armament, including Japan, for example. So I think that China, as much as the West has been pressing North Korea to change its direction, and I think if you look at countries, for example, in the past, like Vietnam, for example, Vietnam used to be a huge problem, but it changes its system towards a market economy, not because Vietnam was invaded by America, but because of the necessity. So here we are seeing North Korea is trying to learn from the Chinese formula, starting with agricultural reform first. Don't forget that when China opened up, it was through the agricultural responsibility system that led in later industrial reform. And of course, this kind of change does not happen very quickly. It takes time.
And Doug, you're skeptical, aren't you, that real change is taking place in North Korea?
I think we have to be very cautious here. First, we really don't know how the power lines run in Pyongyang. I mean, I am skeptical that Kim Jong-un possesses supreme power. I don't think he was, his father spent enough time trying to move him up, far less time than his grandfather used to raise his father up. My guess is that Jang Sung-tak, his uncle and other people there are very important players. I mean, the good news is that Jang apparently has a real interest in economic affairs. He may have been behind the removal of the hardline military leader that was mentioned. I think they were very much rivals. But I suspect we see kind of a collective cooperative leadership. Movement there is going to take some time. They have to get a consensus behind change. We've had hope before. China has been pressing for economic reform in North Korea for years. Kim Jong-Il, would visit. He'd go and look at factories. He would go and look at new industries in China and nod his head and indicate this was a good thing, and go back to North Korea. You didn't see a lot of movement. So we can be hopeful, but I think this is a process that's going to take time, and it's going to require a lot of players in Pyongyang to give their assent, which may be why we're seeing a second meeting of the parliament and why we don't have an obvious change in policy.
And Glyn, say Kim Jong-un really does want to improve things, to really change things up. He can't do it alone, can he? How much resistance does he face in North Korea?
Well, I would agree with the comment that was made that now it's less a charismatic leader than a collective leadership, albeit of friends and family at the top, and that's where the decisions are being made. And they're not being made in the Supreme People's Assembly. That's the vehicle for presenting the decisions. It's interesting that Kim Jong-nam, who is technically the head of state, recently visited Vietnam and Laos looking at reform before a visit to Iran, where they signed a cooperation agreement between Iran and North Korea. So that gives you, if you want, conflicting messages. But yes, things are changing in North Korea. I was in Pyongyang about 3 weeks ago. I mean, it's a vibrant city with everybody on their mobile phone, 100,000 new apartments, new fun fair, water park, dolphinarium, and you can buy anything you want there. Certainly the regime is very careful to look after the people who matter, who are in Pyongyang. Outside of Pyongyang, it's a bit bleaker, not so much in the farming areas, but in some of the big cities in the northeast. And I went to Hamhung, and I was unlucky enough to be there during the typhoon. But I mean, up there, I mean, it's not quite the same. And I think what's happening is they're looking after the people that matter. At the same time, they're putting enormous efforts into trying to get investment in their special economic zones, particularly Rasong and up on Sinuiju, while they're hoping that a new president in South Korea will reopen, if you want, Kaesong, or allow Kaesong to go to the second and third phases and reopen Mount Kumgang.
Andrew, a lot of questions, as Doug pointed out, about who's really in power there in North Korea. There's been a campaign to soften Kim Jong-un's image, isn't there? And this report that the former military head of chief of staff has been removed from all his posts because of illness, and now this hint of possible economic reform. What's going on? Is Kim Jong-il increasing, cementing his power?
Well, of course, the young Kim is only a very, very young kid. Obviously, he's supported by his close relatives. But there is no doubt that there is a sea change in the direction of the country. Then the removal of the former top military brass is no small matter. Don't forget that he was really the very, very powerful person representing the hardliners. And then his sudden removal suggests that the reformists, of course, that includes the young Kim himself, but also his supporting relatives, are really seizing the strong hand and move the country towards a reformist direction. But I just want to add one point about the agricultural reform. It's not more of the same in the sense that previously the so-called agricultural reform is based on a quota. But now it seems that, according to reports, is moving towards a kind of responsibility system. In other words, the farmers would be allowed to keep, according to the reports, something like 30% what they produce. In other words, the more they produce, the more they keep. Whereas with a quota system, first of all, you've got to hit the quota, and the quota is never met. So this is quite different. And if they can change to a more kind of responsibility oriented system, that would be good news. But of course, that's only in agriculture, and of course the industry would come later. But that all takes time. And don't forget, even in China, reforming relatively rapidly, it took really almost a decade before it moved from the agricultural sector to the industrial sector.
Doug, is North Korea shifting from a military-first approach to a more economic one, or is that going too far?
Well, that's the critical thing to watch. It's one thing to remove one hardliner military leader. It's quite another thing to essentially move the military down in priority. And that's a very real challenge. This is a system heavily weighted towards the military. More than 1 million men under arms, military men in various political positions. And I think the challenge is, do you have a civilian leadership that feels strong enough, after the death of Kim Jong-il, to try to move it down in priorities? So I'm not so certain of that. I think that is the real challenge, and that's what we have to watch. Do resources get moved away from the military? Do we see civilian needs taking a more priority? If we see that, that indicates not only economic reform, but it indicates the possibility of negotiating on issues like nuclear weapons, perhaps successfully.
Glyn, do you think resources are being moved away from the military at this point?
I don't think at this point, though I have to say I don't think there are too many soft liners in the military. It may be one particular individual's been moved. I don't think that's necessarily softened the military. I think they will move in that direction, but of course this is in a sense not necessarily entirely good news, because they feel that they can move in that direction because they have nuclear weapons. So the more they, if you want, downgrade the military in terms of shifting resources, the less likely they are to give up their nuclear weapons, which they see as allowing them to make that very change.
Andrew, what do you think? Can North Korea afford to keep things as they are, or is this change?
Well, I think it's not just a kind of black and white matter, but there is no doubt that North Korea will continue to keep a very tight grip on this military, and could continue to rely on a military umbrella, as it were, to guard against any possible foreign aggression or foreign pressure, and it's quite likely that the North Koreans would keep its developing its nuclear armament as a kind of fallback position, especially at the start of its change in direction, so as to maintain the kind of guard against instability. So I think that this saying at this stage that North Korea would give up its military, it's really a kind of naive thinking. So there is no. But while this is going on, while keeping its tight grip on its military, I think that the main thing to look at it, the main way to look at it, is that the country is really changing. Don't forget China. When China opened up, China still keeps a very tight grip, and even now, China keeps a tight grip on this military power. But I think that this change towards a more economic reform, copying the China's example, it is quite encouraging in a way.
Okay, so Andrew, you're pretty optimistic. Doug, how unstable would a reforming North Korea be?
Well, it's hard to say because I don't think anyone has a good sense of the power lines within Pyongyang. I mean, this is a system that's very opaque, that clearly any change changes somewhat the relative balance of power of different factions. And this is a regime that's proved very nervous about potential outside involvement. I mean, they've set up investment zones and tried to seal them. They don't like to have a lot of those contacts. I think that's one reason why Kim Jong-Il was always very nervous about some of the pressure China placed on him to do more opening inside. This regime has survived an awful lot of crises, so I don't think we should assume that it's fragile and ready to break apart. A lot of people have written their epithets of the North Korean regime, and it's survived, and it's gone through, two transitions. Nevertheless, I think given the pressure it's been under, we really don't know internally what those factions are and who might move on whom under what circumstances.
And Glyn, I can see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a fair amount of that, possibly from a slightly different perspective. But I think the power lines are reasonably clear. The power lies within the party. Even the military are in the party, and it resides at the top of the party. If they can keep that group together, we can see change. The problem is whether the change works. I mean, all the evidence in Pyongyang at the moment are that attempts are being made to change. The trouble is that's got to deliver, and you're going to need, if you want investment into these special economic zones and elsewhere, if they're going to get the boost. North Korea is not like China. It's fundamentally an industrial state, and that's why, in a sense, agriculture is far less important. There's nobody else you can decant from agriculture into the civilian economy, unlike China, where if you want redundant agricultural workers, provided the manpower for, if you want, underpinning the new industry.
Andrew, what do you think? How dangerous are reforms for North Korea?
Well, of course, China is no formula for North Korea, 100% formula, because the two countries are different in many ways. But don't forget that even in China, when China started its own reform, there was hardly any kind of sort of export-oriented industry, and that took very long time for China to change. But I think that the fact that the young Kim managed to get himself appointed as the highest authority in the military, that would not have happened without his camp, as it were, gaining the upper hand. And we are not seeing a kind of continuing, at least on the surface, serious struggles that suggest that the army is buying into this change of direction. Because don't forget, in the case of China, the military in China also sees that the opening up of China would be in its best interest to maintain the kind of continued growth, and that way the army's interest would be preserved. And I think that we're seeing maybe something like that, sort of also happening in North Korea. But I think that we should not rule out. I agree with my colleagues that all things could, things could go wrong. I mean, especially in such a serious kind of change of direction. There could be power struggles in the process, as in the case of indeed China in the early stages of development. But I think the most important thing is that once the country is embarking on this change of direction, and once there's some sort of benefits beginning to emerge, I think the momentum would be set. But I think at the end of the day, all things could go wrong quite easily.
Doug, what if North Korea's long-suffering people find their voice?
Well, the challenge here is to move benefits beyond the elite and the nomenclatura in Pyongyang and the military and move it out to the general population. And that will be the ultimate test. If we simply see economic changes where the benefits are concentrated in Pyongyang and are continually lavished on the military, the North Korean people are not going to be benefiting. They need to benefit, and I think that's where the potential instability comes. Is the leadership prepared for a widespread distribution of benefits, and what does that do politically if people start demanding greater access to political power? And that's something where, is the leadership prepared for that? Who in the leadership? We just don't know, but that's ultimately what the North Korean people need. They're desperately suffering. They need to have access to any benefits that come.
Glyn, what happens if North Korea's long-suffering people rise up and demand their rights?
Well, I mean, a rising tide floats all ships. If the North Koreans can get it right, and it's by no means certain that they will, in terms of starting to get the economy to grow like it was in North Korea in the 60s at some of the highest rates in the world, then everybody is going to benefit. If that fails, then that's not going to happen, and that's the dilemma facing the North Korean government administration regime over the it's probably got about 5 years to do that in before things will really get tough.
And Andrew,
well,
can a people's revolution be ruled out completely?
Well, but I think most of the people in North Korea are in the agricultural sector, as it were, and that's why they started trying to start off with an agricultural reform, changing from a quota system to a responsibility system. And I think if that can make to work, that would bring the benefits, at least keep more people alive, as it were, rather than dying of hunger. And I think that also the change in the education system is also important, and trying to bring up the educational standards of the masses. So I think that if they can get initially these two reforms right, that would set the country on a reasonable course for continuing reform. But if things could go wrong and if there are power struggles, then all bets could be off.
Okay, gentlemen, and briefly, before we go, how do you think these hints of changes are being seen by China, North Korea's greatest ally, and America, North Korea's potentially greatest enemy?
China certainly welcomes it. China has been advocating and pressing for economic reform for a long time. I think China wants to preserve a North Korean ally on its border, but it would like one that is less confrontational and more successful. It would prefer to have one that wasn't causing problems with nuclear weapons and one that didn't require the kind of subsidies that it's been providing. Washington at the moment isn't paying an awful lot of attention. There's a presidential election. The U.S. is far more concerned for a number of reasons about Iran than North Korea. I think the issue is going to reemerge next year after the election and a new administration is in place. But at the moment, this is an issue that's been pushed to the back burner here in the United States.
Indeed. Andrew, you are nodding your head in agreement, I presume, with Doug?
Yes, I generally agreed. I think the test, there's no doubt that China welcomes it. But of course, the test for America is the relaxation or abolition of those sanctions. But that, of course, depends on the delivery of real results and, of course, on the improvements and then on the kind of nuclear armament kind of situation. So I think that there's too early days yet as far as America is concerned. But there is no doubt that China welcomes this kind of momentum.
Okay, and Glyn, last word to you. How do you think China and the US see what's going on in North Korea?
Well, I would agree with the other two, that China very much welcomes this. I would disagree in the sense that Korea is not fundamentally an agricultural country. It's an industrial country. And while people are hungry, nobody's dying. But certainly everybody could do with seeing the economy boosted. I agree again, the United States is not paying any attention. Actually, we've had, if you want, leadership change in North Korea. We've got leadership change change coming in a variety of ways in China, South Korea and the United States. Even a re-elected Obama will be in a very different position from before. So I would be interested to see what's going to happen in late spring, early summer next year, when there's going to be a window of opportunity with those 4 new regimes, 4 new administrations capable of looking at what might be possible.
Gentlemen, thank you all for your time. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leung. In Washington, D.C., Doug Bandow. And in Brussels, Glyn Ford. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you have any feedback, do email us your thoughts at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.